Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Michael Wald. You're listening to Ask the Blood Detective, and today's topic is a continuation of my last topic, which was entitled Weird and Wacky Weight Loss Solutions, and we focused on heavy metals and how heavy metals, through various inflammatory and oxidative and toxic properties, can cause not just regular, ordinary weight gain, but also obesity. And there's, of course, a chronic disease connection also to these heavy metals. So if you missed that show, I would encourage you to listen to it, because for those of you who have had issues losing weight, if you are just unsatisfied with the results that you've had, even though you may have tried many seemingly reasonable ways of losing weight, it might be a metals issue. Today we're going to talk about overweight and also obesity and the inflammation connection there. Most of my patients, and I can say that in all honesty, that I've consulted with over the last 30 some odd years, they seem entirely unaware of the potential role of inflammation in not just weight loss and weight gain, but just disease and the human aging process as a whole. And we've known now for over 3 decades that inflammation is a fundamental way in which the body ages, breaks down, and gets disease. So any strategies that we have, and I would imagine if they were as natural as possible, would be important for us to know, so that we can implement into our lives to reduce our inflammatory load so that we maintain a healthy weight and the lowest possible risk of developing both acute and chronic degenerative diseases. But today, again, is going to be a short but focused conversation about inflammation and inflammation's role in fat gain. For those of you that are new to the show, again, my name is Dr. Michael Wald. I am the Blood Detective, and you can reach me at info@blooddetective.com or go to my website at drmichaelwald.com. Now, in traditional medicine, the discovery of systemic inflammation as a health factor is actually fairly recent. I don't know, maybe it's a half a dozen years or so. That's considered recent. I've been aware of it for I would say over 35 years, because I've been interested in nutrition even as a teenager, and I was reading things about this way back then. So medicine is generally very slow to catch up on these concepts. The alternative medicine field is a lot quicker. They have known about and they believe in and they have effective methods to manage chronic systemic inflammation, and they keep that in mind. And I put myself in that category whenever they're seeing a patient with any health problem whatsoever. You know, what is amazing to know, at least I think, is that various diseases, all the major diseases that you've heard of, are related to chronic inflammation. Some of them more than others. We absolutely know that with overweight and especially obesity, inflammation is a major player. It's a major factor that needs to be addressed and managed for weight loss to happen. If you've got chronic levels of inflammation and you're reducing your calories, that's just not going to work. You've already done that. You've already been there. You've already tried it. We also know that inflammation is related to something called metabolic syndrome. The reason I mention metabolic syndrome is that this condition, which I'll describe in a moment, it includes overweight and just outright obesity as a consequence of the metabolic derangements. So metabolic syndrome is a term which describes basically 3 conditions that tend to eventually occur together. That's overweight or obesity, hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, and hyperlipidemia, high blood fats. So overweight, also hypertension. So hypertension, overweight, high blood sugar, high blood fats. And many patients that I've seen, they may have 2 of the components of that disease I just mentioned. They might have 3 of them or just 1 of them. And then they think if they don't have them all at the same time, they don't have those conditions. If I see a patient and they say to me, well, my blood pressure is borderline high, mostly it's fine, sometimes it's not, and I'm overweight, and my cholesterol is a little high, but my blood sugar is fine, I'm thinking this person is on their way to metabolic syndrome, right? That's the blood detective common sense. But physicians wait until the disease is just outright present. If they're going to diagnose you with metabolic syndrome and give you the specific medications they would give you for that condition, or that conditions, I should say, they will not do a thing unless you've got all three of these conditions present at once, which is just a silly way of approaching things. Because big problems like metabolic syndrome and big diseases like heart disease and diabetes and autoimmune diseases and cancer and arthritis, for example, before they were big things, they were small things. So we want to identify these issues as early as possible, and through preventative, proactive measures that are hopefully as natural as possible, intervene preemptively. In order to appreciate the role of inflammation in overweight and obesity, we need to talk about some of the conditions that are associated with obesity and inflammation. And then I'm going to describe this concept to you known as meta-inflammation. So obesity and overweight, and I'm just going to say obesity from now on, folks. So if you're not obese but you're overweight, please forgive me. It's just for the ease of the show. So obesity is linked to stroke, various cancers, both types of diabetes, but particularly type 2 diabetes, and heart disease of different forms. So these conditions tend to go along with obesity. And it's thought that they do because these conditions are inflammatory conditions. Heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, they are inflammatory. Inflammation, as I've mentioned before, is a biochemical language that increases or talks to fat cells, increasing their size and the persistence of them remaining. And not only that, there are many other ways in which these conditions can predispose to obesity. I'll give you one more. And that would be through the inflammatory process, the inflammatory mediators like interleukin-6, as just to give you one example, they turn on all the wrong genes, which encode for all the wrong proteins, which produce yet other inflammatory mediators, which can create weight gain and worsen the diseases that we're talking about: heart, stroke, diabetes, cancer. And you must realize that even right now, the likelihood of you walking around with a low-grade chronic inflammation is near 100%. So you may feel fine. You might say, well, I don't have any symptoms of inflammation. Wouldn't that be like my toe hurts or my joint hurts? Yes, those are examples of inflammation. But sometimes you don't feel the inflammation. The inflammation might result in a stroke, which is what we call the silent killer. Inflammation may be pushing up your blood pressure, but you don't generally feel high blood pressure. You may have heart disease, hardening of your arteries and clots forming in your blood vessels, but you don't feel that. Or you might feel subtle things until it gets bad enough where you then get a symptom that you cannot ignore and you can't mistake it. And then obviously cancer. You have abnormal cells, which can be triggered by any number of things, including inflammation, which damage DNA, and then those cells copy themselves in a damaged form, and then they make more and more cells, which is called proliferation. And proliferation is a normal process in the body. We need proliferation of old cells to get new cells. But when we have old cells that are damaged, which have the wrong DNA, which means it's going to express the wrong proteins for all the wrong reasons and give you things like cancer, you may not feel this. Most people don't simply wake up one day with cancer. Although they'll say, well, I'd never had symptoms before that. It was just diagnosed. Well, there was a process obviously going on, and it involved chronic low-grade or higher-grade inflammation. And then if this systemic inflammation increases, it can add even more diseases to the niche. It could add autoimmune diseases of various types, whether it's lupus or Sjogren's or Hashimoto's thyroiditis or Graves' disease, just to name a few. Inflammation disrupts cellular tissues. The tissues break down. They no longer look like normal tissues. Part of your immune system recognizes that. It sends out antibodies. The antibodies release inflammatory mediators, and those inflammatory mediators further the damage, and this vicious cycle, as it's called, of degenerative changes exceeds the regenerative changes, and you end up with the disease. This is where the role of nutrition is so important. If you get nutrition right, your reparative process will exceed the degenerative process, and that's when healing happens. So with the metabolic syndrome I mentioned before, which is essentially high blood sugar, high blood fat, and high blood pressure, the low-grade inflammation becomes higher and higher over time, and it sort of accumulates and disrupts other physiologic pathways, resulting in these seemingly separate conditions, but we know now they are not generally separate conditions. They result from a process known as meta-inflammation. So meta-inflammation basically is the metabolic inflammatory state associated with insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. So the condition is considered and defined as a low-grade chronic inflammatory state. So what you need to know is that if you gain fat for any reason, you are increasing your inflammatory state, you are upregulating or increasing certain aspects of your immune system that is pro-inflammatory, not a good thing, increasing your risk of many diseases. Now, even though I just mentioned that increasing weight in the form of fat increases inflammation, you can also lose weight, and that could also lead to inflammation too if the weight loss is, again, not from the right places. You want that weight loss to be from fat and water retention, not from lean body mass retention. So you might be thinking, well, what are some of the actual sources exactly of some of these mental issues? I'm sorry, not mental issues, but some of these inflammatory issues. Well, first of all, the first thing that comes to my mind is gut inflammation. So inflammation in the intestinal tract is known to produce weight gain on the body, completely separate from caloric intake. This is why with all of my patients with weight issues, I'm focusing on their guts. I need to provide the proper pre and probiotics, which can reduce inflammation in the intestinal tract, and those inflammatory mediators can leak through the intestinal tract. They get their way into the general circulation, and depending on where that circulation goes, whatever gets that circulation in those inflammatory mediators can be damaged. So if the brain is asserted the major brunt of these inflammatory mediators, then there could be dementia or just poor memory, brain fog. If it is the blood vessels that are being harmed the most by the inflammatory mediators in circulation, then we get hardening of the arteries, which is an inflammatory process. And anywhere there's inflammation, the body pulls calcium to it, so the calcium gets pulled out of the bone from inflammation, and it gets stuck in the arteries, causing hardening of the arteries. So that's a very, very interesting but well-proven issue. And also, if you were to eat a healthy diet with lots of vegetables, for example, that is extremely important for the gut, assuming you're not allergic or don't have any intolerances to vegetables. And a plant-based diet overall is probably the best diet if I had to choose one for everyone. But if you want to lift weights and gain muscle, then that may not be the best one for you. You might have to supplement it. And if you're starting with a plant-based diet, but you have, let's say, an autoimmune condition, let's say like thyroid disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, you might have to take extra plant-based protein and other nutritional supplements to make up for what the plant-based diet just doesn't give you. So I start with a plant-based diet for some individuals, but not for all. I have other patients that they don't want to change their lousy diets at all. And I'm left with using nutritional supplements, exercise, stress reduction, and some other lifestyle means to reduce inflammation. And sometimes that actually works. And with this chronic inflammation going on, that is sometimes a message, again, to the genes to increase the production of blood fats. So your total cholesterol, your bad LDL cholesterol, and your good HDL cholesterol may go in all the wrong directions, driving cellular inflammation, infiltration, I should say, and pro-inflammatory state of the body. That's why omega-3 fatty acids are particularly good, but omega-6 fatty acids are generally pro-inflammatory. So evening primrose oil, pro-inflammatory. Omega-3 fatty acids, anti-inflammatory. The omega-3 fats are generally composed of EPA and DHA. Those are good oils. Flaxseed oil has omega-3s, but it also has omega-6s and omega-9s. The omega-9s are fine, but those omega-6s are pro-inflammatory, so I do not like the flaxseed oil. And here's another key way in which inflammation drives the fat retention process. Basically, inflammation does that. It's a precursor to weight gain because it makes you more prone to insulin resistance. Also type 2 diabetes, various forms of cardiovascular disease, systemic and systemic inflammation overall. So what happens here is that inflammation causes insulin resistance, which can result in all these other conditions that I just mentioned. And on the other hand, think of people with autoimmune diseases, inflammatory conditions, whether it's any one of several cancers or rheumatoid arthritis or psoriatic arthritis, or anything inflammatory. What happens here is that inflammation tends to promote insulin resistance and metabolic disorders that can result in increasing the wrong fats, increasing the pressure, and increasing the sugar. So people with these inflammatory issues need to know what diet, exercise, lifestyle, and nutritional supplements are best for them. And then if they have extreme levels of inflammation, because they'll vary obviously from person to person, you would then adjust the diet and the nutritional supplements for their level of inflammation. And there are just overall health problems. So part of what I'm actually saying here is that excessive inflammation can cause excessive weight that's generally equal to the amount of inflammation. A lot of inflammation, a lot of weight. And the inflammatory process tends to disrupt hormones, causing maladaptive disruptions in certain hormones involved in, let's say, hunger signaling. But it's not just those hormones. So you should be thinking, okay, so what are some other ways I can fight this inflammation? Well, some general ways, I'll review a few in a second, and then the more specific ways are dependent on the degree to which you have various diseases, again, medications, and all these other factors that are individualized that can be used to figure out specific nutritional supplements and foods, again, among other healthful ways. But in general, there are a couple of things I can mention to you. One is olive oil. So olive oil is omega-9 fatty acid. It's that oil that's high in the Mediterranean type diet that's been attributed to lowering a cardiovascular risk, and it does. Except I would go a little bit further here. The type of oil you want is olive oil, but you want it to be Italian olive oil, cold pressed olive oil in a tin, which is a stainless steel non-leaching container that does not permit light to hit the oil. You want the oil to be protected from light and air and heat as much as possible. So when you're cooking with olive oil, you want to cook on a lower flame, the lowest flame as possible, and don't fry it. That makes it entirely toxic, filled with reactive inflammatory species. So once again, we want cold-pressed, imported Italian olive oil in a tin. And when you purchase your olive oil, purchase it in the smallest tin as possible, because you know how olive oil works. You have it in your refrigerator for years and years and years. At least that's the way I grew up. And if it's in a glass container, if you can see the oil, that means light can see it. And the photons of light disrupt the oil and oxidize it. So does the air every time you open up the container. So if you buy the smaller containers, you're simply going to use that oil up faster. And I can think of no worse way, well, maybe a few, but this is really up there, a worse way to mess your health up by drinking oxidized oil. Then you want to increase your consumption of green leafy vegetables such as spinach, collards, and kale, as long as you're not on Coumadin or some other types of blood thinners that might be interfered with due to increased vitamin K production for the vegetables. So how it works now in medicine is that if you're not on these medications, then you don't have to worry about eating green leafy vegetables. But if you're on Coumadin, for example, that blood thinner, and you normally do not eat green leafy vegetables, I'm going to say that again. If you normally do not eat green leafy vegetables and you're on an anticoagulant, do not start eating a lot of green leafy vegetables, because you will interfere with that medication. And if you want that medication to work, it's tricky enough to get the Coumadin to work anyway, and the confusion with the diet can make it worse, because, as I mentioned, the green leafy vegetables enhance vitamin K in your body. Vitamin K is a potential pro-clotting agent, because the body needs to clot blood too, It doesn't just need to thin blood. But if you're on Coumadin for thinning and you're taking and you're eating all these vegetables, you're going to interfere with that medication. But if you are not on the medication, you're good to go. And, I try to determine what other foods my patients exactly need for their health beyond this general information I'm giving you now, like me saying increasing the green leafy vegetables. Also, you want to increase your intake of nuts and seeds. So I would suggest that they are not roasted, because when you roast nuts and seeds, you increase the saturated content, the saturated fat content of these nuts, and that only increases the viscosity or thickness of your blood. It could increase cardiovascular risk, can increase inflammation and oxidative stress. That's the key. You don't want these nuts putting weight on you. That would be absolutely nuts. Okay, so in terms of the nuts and seeds, you want raw seeds, raw almonds, raw cashews, raw walnuts, for example. And then you want to consume fish. Now, if you're a vegetarian and you don't want to eat fish, that's perfectly fine. You'd have to work with someone who's adept at figuring the proper diet out for you to get enough omega-3s. But if you're not a vegetarian, then the fatty fish like salmon, tuna, sardines, mackerel, these are going to be beneficial because of their omega-3 fatty acid content. Because omega-3s are antioxidants, they're anti-inflammatory, they reduce oxidative stress, they store themselves in the fat in your body, which is the bad fat, and then it sort of it's like a bait and switch where the omega-3s content of your fat tissue increases, and that helps lose weight. And then you want to increase your intake of strawberries, blueberries, oranges, cherries. These fruits have phytonutrients and antioxidants that are obviously anti-inflammatory. Coffee actually is an anti-inflammatory that may make a difference if you have at least a cup a day. And there are reasons that some people should not be consuming coffee, but again, I don't know your health, so these are just general considerations, just education that should not replace sound medical and health advice. And on the other hand, foods that might increase inflammation could be anything, by the way. I mean, if you have a sensitivity to broccoli, that could increase inflammation. But generally speaking, the refined carbohydrates, the white breads and pastries, they are pro-inflammatory. French fries, any fried foods, obviously pro-inflammatory, extremely detrimental for health. Sodas, which by definition contain phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of the leading causes, in the form of soda, by the way, of osteoporosis in the United States. So soda's no good. Seltzer water, that's perfectly fine. Flavored waters that are flavored naturally are probably also fine. And anything sugar sweetened that's a beverage or refined and processed sugars, bad stuff. I should mention too that there may be specific foods, there certainly are specific nutritional supplements that in some people act in an anti-inflammatory fashion, and in others they act in a pro-inflammatory fashion. So that is a reverse effect, that term I mentioned earlier. And reverse effect basically means that at one level of dosing, a food or a nutritional compound, like a vitamin or mineral or phytonutrient or nutraceutical, may have anti-inflammatory and weight loss potential, but when taken at a different dose, act completely differently. And that's where individualization of the whole anti-inflammatory weight loss plan comes into place. So I hope you do take some of this information to heart and don't join the 400 or so million adults who are obese. And that doesn't even include the count on those that are just overweight, according to the World Health Organization globally, as I mentioned. Thank you for listening to this show. The next one will again be another continuation of wacky weight loss solutions that I'll focus only upon the hormonal connection to weight gain and weight loss. My name is Dr. Michael Wald. You've been listening to Ask the Blood Detective. Email me at info@blooddetective.com. Go to my website at drmichaelwald.com. Thanks, everyone. Talk with you soon.